a family mysteriously vanishes, and one man calmly admits to it all. But his motive? It's even darker than anyone could have imagined. In the quiet suburb of Tarpon Springs, Florida, the Ivancic family was known for their warmth and close-knit bonds. Neighbors often saw Richard and Laura Ivancic enjoying their retirement, their son Nicholas dropping by for family dinners, and their daughter Jamie's laughter filling the home during her visits. Their three beloved Bichon Frise mixes, Bailey, Bloomer, and Buddy, added to the household's lively atmosphere. But as 2018 drew to a close, an unsettling silence enveloped their residence. Calls went unanswered, and the once active household seemed eerily still. Concerned friends and relatives, unable to reach the family, alerted the authorities. On New Year's Day 2019, police entered the Ivancic home, only to be met with a scene that would haunt them forever. Richard, Laura, and Nicholas were found lifeless, their bodies bearing the marks of a brutal attack. The three dogs, too, had met a tragic end. As investigators delved deeper, they discovered that Jamie had been missing for nearly a year. Her husband, Shelby Nealy, had been impersonating her through text messages, deceiving her family into believing she was alive. The trail of deception and murder led authorities to Nealy, who, when confronted, confessed to the heinous acts. The question that lingered was, what darkness could drive a man to annihilate an entire family, leaving a community in shock and disbelief? Join us on this channel while we uncover the tragedy that casts a long shadow over a once happy family and expose the whole crime. It began with a call, one filled with concern, not panic. A man, trying to reach his elderly parents and younger brother, had heard nothing from them since Christmas. No return calls, no replies to messages. For a family as close as the Ivancics, this silence was deafening. When officers arrived at the Tarpon Springs home for a welfare check, they were met with locked doors and an ominous stillness. The kind of stillness that makes you hesitate before stepping inside. But once they did, nothing could have prepared them for what they found. The scene was gruesome. Richard, Laura, and Nicholas Ivancic were discovered lifeless, their bodies in an advanced state of decomposition. Each room seemed to hold a piece of the horrifying puzzle, but the entire picture remained obscured. Attempts had been made to erase the evidence, hasty, sloppy efforts to clean the blood and mask the odor. What baffled detectives wasn't just the brutality of the crime, but the unanswered questions it raised. Where was Jamie Ivancic, the family's daughter and sister? And where were her two young children? In those first moments, the case seemed straightforward, yet it was anything but. Because when detectives began digging deeper, the answers they uncovered would only lead to more disturbing revelations. This wasn't just a tragic murder. It was something far more chilling, a story that stretched across states and timelines, with secrets buried in more ways than one. As officers pieced together the events leading up to that fateful day, one name emerged as the thread tying it all together: Shelby Nealy. Who was he? A family member by marriage, a seemingly quiet man. But the more they learned, the more unsettling the picture became. What drove a person to such horrifying extremes? And why? These were the questions investigators had to answer. And as they did, the truth would leave even the most seasoned detectives shaken. The first clues came from the scene itself, though they were anything but straightforward. Inside the Ivancic home, detectives noted an unmistakable effort to cover up what had happened. Walls bore patches of uneven paint, hastily applied to conceal bloodstains. The pungent smell of cleaning chemicals lingered in the air, though their work had been far from thorough. In the backyard, a shallow hole hinted at a plan abandoned midway. But who had done this, and why? With no immediate witnesses and the victims unable to tell their story, investigators turned to what they could control: forensics and circumstantial evidence. They scoured the property for anything that might offer a lead. Amid the chaos, they noticed something was missing: the family's car, a dark-colored minivan. Whoever had committed these murders had likely taken the vehicle to escape. It didn't take long for authorities to enter the vehicle's details into the national database, flagging it for officers across the country. Then they turned to financial records. They began tracking the credit cards belonging to Richard and Laura Ivancic, hoping the killer had made the mistake of using them. As the investigation stretched into its second day, a breakthrough came from an unexpected place: the neighbors. Several neighbors mentioned seeing a man in his 20s digging the shallow hole in the backyard not long before the murders. He wasn't alone. A small child had been with him, quietly playing nearby. The description of the man stood out: dark hair, lean build, and most importantly, someone the Ivancics were comfortable enough to let near their property. It was the first solid lead. The suspect wasn't a stranger. Detectives expanded their search to family members, friends, and acquaintances. It was during this process that a troubling pattern emerged. No one had seen or heard from Jamie Ivancic in months. Her husband, Shelby Nealy, claimed she was simply busy with work and life. He'd even sent text messages to her parents on her behalf, reassuring them that she and the kids were fine. But as investigators pressed further, they realized that no one had physically seen Jamie since early 2018. The missing car and the suspicious use of credit cards eventually gave detectives their next clue. Days after the welfare check, officers located the stolen minivan in Lakewood, Ohio, nearly 1,000 miles away from Florida. And driving it was none other than Shelby Nealy. Detectives had their target. After tracking Shelby Nealy to Lakewood, Ohio, officers quietly surrounded the area where he had been staying. He was using the Ivancic family's stolen car, unaware or unconcerned that it had already been flagged by law enforcement. The officers moved in swiftly, expecting resistance, or at least the kind of panic they'd seen in suspects cornered by their own guilt. But Shelby's reaction was nothing like they anticipated. When the police approached, Shelby stepped out of the car without hesitation. He didn't run. He didn't plead innocence. Instead, he simply looked at them, calm and compliant, as though he had been expecting this moment. He didn't say a word as they cuffed him, seated him in the back of the police cruiser, and transported him to the station. His composure wasn't just unsettling, it was haunting. Once inside the interrogation room, Shelby's demeanor remained the same. Sitting across from Detective Anderson, he accepted the offered coffee and even thanked the officer. There were no signs of stress, no fidgeting, no hesitation. It was as if they weren't about to discuss 3 brutal murders and the complete annihilation of a family. The detective broke the silence. "Shelby, you know why you're here?" Shelby leaned back in his chair, cupping the coffee in his hands. "Yeah, I know. You're here about the Ivancics." The detective paused, waiting for Shelby to elaborate. When he didn't, Anderson pressed. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" Shelby's response was chilling in its simplicity. "Well, obviously I did it. I mean, where do you want me to start?" The events leading to the murders unfolded over a span of just 2 days, yet each moment seemed meticulously calculated in Shelby Nealy's mind. It was as though he had mapped out every detail, carefully choreographing his actions to avoid detection. What makes these murders even more chilling is not just the brutality, but the eerie calm with which Shelby carried them out, one by one, with no hesitation. It began with Richard, the patriarch of the Ivancic family. Shelby had arrived at their Tarpon Springs home under the guise of visiting for the holidays. To everyone else, it was just another family gathering. To Shelby, it was the beginning of his plan to silence anyone who might uncover the truth about Jamie. On the evening of December 15th, Shelby waited for the right moment. Richard, a 71-year-old man who had spent his life providing for his family, was alone in the dining room. Shelby approached him from behind, carrying the hammer he had brought with him from Ohio. Without a word, he struck Richard on the back of the head. The first blow rendered him unconscious, and Shelby quickly delivered several more to ensure he was dead. Richard didn't have time to react, and Shelby later told detectives he wanted it to be quick. But this wasn't mercy, it was efficiency. Shelby dragged Richard's body into the master bedroom, leaving behind a trail of blood that he would later attempt to clean. He covered the body with an area rug, taking care to avoid arousing suspicion from anyone who might enter the house. With Richard's body hidden, Shelby calmly resumed his activities. He cleaned up just enough to delay anyone noticing what had happened and waited for Laura, Richard's wife, to return home. Laura Ivancic, 59, came home later that evening, unaware of the nightmare waiting for her. Shelby greeted her at the door with a smile, pretending everything was normal. As Laura walked toward the kitchen, Shelby followed closely behind, the hammer concealed in his hand. When she reached the kitchen, Shelby struck. His first blow landed on the back of her head, just as it had with Richard. Laura collapsed instantly, and Shelby ensured she wouldn't survive by striking her again. He later claimed she never saw it coming. Shelby dragged Laura's body into the bedroom where Richard lay, placing her next to her husband. The room, once a place of warmth and family, had become a macabre scene of death. Despite the horrific nature of what he had done, Shelby showed no signs of emotional distress. He calmly cleaned up the blood in the kitchen and living room, methodically scrubbing the floors and repainting the walls where stains couldn't be removed. He took breaks to check on his children, who were asleep in another room, completely unaware of the horrors unfolding just a few feet away. The next day, December 16th, brought the arrival of Nicholas Ivancic, the youngest member of the family. At 25 years old, Nicholas was known for his kindness and love for his family. He had no reason to suspect the danger that awaited him when he came home that evening. When Nicholas arrived, Shelby played the role of a friendly brother-in-law. They shared a meal together, talked, and even smoked weed. To Nicholas, it was a normal evening with family. To Shelby, it was the prelude to another calculated killing. After a few hours, Nicholas fell asleep on the living room couch. Shelby waited until he was certain Nicholas was unconscious before retrieving the hammer once again. In the stillness of the early morning hours, Shelby stood over his brother-in-law and delivered the first blow to the side of his head. Unlike the others, Nicholas jolted awake, though he was too disoriented to react. Shelby struck him again and again until he was sure Nicholas was dead. This time, the blood splatter was far greater than Shelby anticipated. He later admitted to detectives that this murder had been the messiest and the most difficult to clean. But once again, his focus wasn't on the horror of what he had done. It was on maintaining the illusion of normalcy. Shelby dragged Nicholas's body into the same room where Richard and Laura lay, completing what he believed was a necessary step in his plan to protect himself and his children. He rearranged furniture in the living room to cover any remaining bloodstains, moving a couch to block access to the master bedroom. What's perhaps most chilling is the composure Shelby maintained throughout. He didn't panic, didn't falter. He methodically executed each murder and then carried on as if nothing had happened. The murders were over, but for Shelby Nealy, the work had just begun. 3 lives had been taken inside the Ivancic home, and with each passing moment, the risk of discovery grew. Shelby knew he couldn't leave the bodies where they were without someone eventually noticing. So in the hours and days that followed, he set about trying to erase the evidence of his crimes, each step as calculated as the murders themselves. Shelby's first priority was to contain the scene. Bloodstains from the murders stretched across multiple rooms in the house, on floors, walls, and furniture. He started by scrubbing the floors with cleaning chemicals, attempting to remove the visible stains. Where cleaning wasn't enough, he painted over the blood, using whatever supplies he could find in the house. The results were sloppy and uneven, but to Shelby, it was better than nothing. The bodies of Richard, Laura, and Nicholas had been moved to the master bedroom, wrapped hastily in area rugs. But Shelby wasn't satisfied leaving them there. He needed a more permanent solution. In the backyard of the Ivancic home, Shelby began digging a trench. It was shallow, narrow, and clearly intended to serve as a makeshift grave. Witnesses later reported seeing him working in the yard, accompanied by one of his children, who played nearby as if it were just another day. The trench, however, proved to be a more difficult task than Shelby anticipated. The Florida soil was hard, and digging deep enough to bury 3 bodies was time-consuming. Paranoia began to set in. Shelby later admitted he feared the neighbors might notice what he was doing and call the authorities. After several hours of work spread over multiple days, he abandoned the plan altogether. The bodies remained in the house. Even the Ivancic family's beloved dogs weren't spared from Shelby's attempt to cover his tracks. 3 small Bichon Frise mixes, Bailey, Bloomer, and Buddy, had been a constant presence in the Ivancic household. To Shelby, however, they were liabilities, potential sources of noise that could draw attention to the home. Shelby made a chilling decision. He placed the dogs into garbage bags and tied them shut, leaving them to suffocate. One of the dogs, already in poor health due to untreated diabetes, had been left to die from lack of care before being struck with the side of a hammer to put it out of its misery. For the other 2, there was no justification, only the cold, calculated choice to eliminate any loose ends. With the bodies hidden in the master bedroom and the dogs silenced, Shelby turned his attention to his escape. He packed up his 2 young children and loaded them into the Ivancic family's minivan. The stolen vehicle was filled with items he intended to use to continue covering his tracks, tarps, rope, and personal effects from the house that could later be disposed of. Before leaving, Shelby left the house in a state of disarray, perhaps hoping it would discourage anyone from entering too soon. Furniture was rearranged, blood was partially cleaned, and the backyard trench was left unfinished. Shelby then drove out of Florida, heading north to Ohio, where he planned to lay low. Along the way, he used the Ivancic's credit cards at gas stations and pawn shops, trading items for cash and fueling his journey. His trail of transactions provided a map for investigators to follow, but at the time, he seemed unconcerned. For weeks, Shelby managed to avoid detection. He stayed in motels and transient housing, relying on the stolen minivan for transportation and using cash from pawned items to sustain himself and his children. To those who interacted with him during this time, Shelby appeared unremarkable, a single father on the move, struggling to make ends meet. What allowed Shelby to stay under the radar wasn't just his low profile. It was also the elaborate lies he had already put in place. By pretending to be Jamie, through text messages and carefully staged photos, he had ensured that no one in the Ivancic family's circle suspected anything was amiss. His deception bought him precious time. The aftermath of Shelby's crimes was devastating. He had not only taken the lives of 3 family members and their beloved pets, but had also left a gaping hole in the lives of his children, who had now lost both parents. His actions were a calculated attempt to preserve his version of control, but they had instead unraveled into chaos, leaving behind a trail of loss and unanswered questions. By the time the interrogation ended, detectives had what they needed. Shelby had confessed not only to the murders of Richard, Laura, and Nicholas Ivancic, but also to Jamie's death and the cover-up that followed. His confessions were chilling in their detail, and his lack of remorse was nothing short of unnerving. As Shelby was led back to his cell, Detective Anderson couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't dealing with an ordinary killer. Shelby Nealy's actions weren't impulsive or emotional. They were calculated, deliberate, and executed with a level of detachment that defied comprehension. But even with his confessions, there was more to uncover. Back in Florida, investigators prepared to dig deeper, both figuratively and literally, to find the evidence Shelby had so calmly described. What they would discover would confirm the horrors Shelby had confessed to and solidify his place as one of the most chilling figures they had ever encountered. As detectives pieced together Shelby's actions and motives, they consulted experts to better understand the man behind the crimes. Dr. Garson described Shelby's behavior as indicative of psychopathy, pointing to his lack of empathy, manipulative tendencies, and superficial charm. Shelby demonstrated a complete absence of remorse, Garson explained. He spoke about his actions as if they were logical solutions to problems, not the horrific crimes they were. Shelby's year-long cover-up also revealed a high degree of planning and foresight. He didn't act out of impulse, Garson said. Everything he did, texting as Jamie, staging photos, even deciding when and how to kill the Ivancics, was calculated. However, not all experts agreed on a diagnosis of psychopathy. Some suggested that Shelby's actions were driven more by delusion and paranoia than by a total lack of morality. Dr. Marcus Levin, a criminal psychologist, argued that Shelby's fixation on protecting his children indicated a deeply distorted but genuine belief that he was doing the right thing. Shelby viewed himself as the hero of this story, Levin explained. In his mind, every decision he made was for the sake of his kids. That's what makes his actions so terrifying, because he truly believed he was justified. Shelby Nealy's trial was one of the most anticipated in the state of Florida, not only for the brutality of his crimes, but for the complex legal proceedings that followed his arrest. His case, spanning multiple murders, animal cruelty, and the year-long deception of his wife's family, posed challenges for prosecutors and defense alike. The question wasn't whether Shelby was guilty. His confessions had ensured that, but what his ultimate fate should be. On December 13, 2023, nearly 5 years after his arrest, Shelby Nealy stood before a judge in Pinellas County, Florida. The once calm man who had unnerved detectives with his eerie composure now wore the weight of his actions. Facing the court, he entered a guilty plea for the murder of his wife, Jamie Ivancic. Shelby admitted to killing Jamie during what he described as an act of self-defense, though prosecutors argued it was a calculated decision driven by paranoia and control. His cooperation in leading authorities to Jamie's remains, buried in the backyard of their Port Richey home, was a key factor in his plea deal. In exchange, Shelby avoided the death penalty for Jamie's murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The guilty plea for Jamie's death, however, was just the beginning. Shelby faced additional charges for the murders of Richard, Laura, and Nicholas Ivancic, as well as 3 counts of aggravated animal cruelty for killing the family's dogs. Unlike Jamie's case, the murders of the Ivancic family were premeditated, and prosecutors sought the harshest punishment possible, death. The penalty phase for the triple homicide was scheduled for October 2024. During which a jury would decide whether Shelby should face the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole. Legal experts described the case as uniquely challenging, given Shelby's willingness to cooperate with investigators. His confessions, while horrifying, were also instrumental in piecing together the full scope of the crimes. Shelby's defense team painted a picture of a man overwhelmed by mental instability and fear. They argued that Shelby's paranoia about losing his children clouded his judgment and drove him to commit the murders. They pointed to his history of trauma, including alleged abuse in his youth and the loss of his father, as factors that influenced his actions. It doesn't excuse what he did, one of his attorneys said during the trial, but it provides context. Shelby Nealy was a man who believed, however irrationally, that he had no choice. The defense also emphasized Shelby's cooperation with law enforcement. His confessions, though chilling, saved investigators months, if not years, of work and brought some closure to Jamie's grieving family. The prosecution, however, dismissed the idea that Shelby's cooperation was a sign of remorse. They portrayed him as a manipulative killer who meticulously planned the murders to cover up his crime against Jamie. His year-long charade, during which he pretended Jamie was alive, was presented as evidence of his cold, calculating nature. Shelby Nealy didn't just kill, the lead prosecutor stated during the penalty phase. He lied. He manipulated. He forced a grieving family to hold onto false hope, all while knowing exactly what he had done. The prosecution argued that Shelby's actions warranted the ultimate punishment, emphasizing the brutality of the murders and the lasting impact on the Ivancic family's surviving members, particularly Jamie's parents, who had to endure both the loss of their daughter and the violent deaths of their son and grandchildren's grandparents. The public, too, was divided. Some viewed Shelby's cooperation as a mitigating factor, believing that life in prison without parole was a fitting punishment. Others, including many of the Ivancic's extended family members, felt that nothing short of the death penalty could account for the depth of his crimes. The media coverage of the trial highlighted the haunting nature of Shelby's actions. Headlines described him as a man who destroyed a family, and commentators debated whether his claims of acting out of fear for his children held any truth or were merely a convenient excuse. As of now, the penalty phase remains ongoing. A jury will ultimately decide whether Shelby Nealy will spend the rest of his life behind bars or face execution for the murders of Richard, Laura, and Nicholas Ivancic. For many, the delay in justice has been agonizing, with each court appearance serving as a painful reminder of the lives lost. Regardless of the outcome, one thing is clear. Shelby's crimes have left an indelible mark on all who knew the Ivancic family. Even with his chilling cooperation, many believe that justice hasn't been fully served. The true cost of his actions can never be measured, not in years or sentences, but in the lives and trust that were irreparably shattered. The story of Shelby Nealy is one that leaves us grappling with more questions than answers. Was he a victim of his own paranoia, pushed to the brink by fear of losing his children? Or was he a cold, calculating individual who used that fear as an excuse for unspeakable acts? Could this tragedy have been prevented? Or were the warning signs too subtle for anyone to act in time? What's most unsettling about this case isn't just the crimes themselves, but the detachment with which Shelby carried them out. Was his cooperation with law enforcement a sign of remorse, or just another way to control the narrative? For the families left behind, no sentence, life in prison, or even the death penalty will ever bring back their loved ones. And for the two young children caught in the middle of this nightmare, the impact of Shelby's decisions will likely haunt them for the rest of their lives. Now we turn to you. Do you believe Shelby's actions were driven by desperation, or do they reveal a man incapable of empathy or remorse? Should his cooperation with investigators be enough to spare him from the death penalty, or do his crimes demand the harshest punishment? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your opinions in the comments below, and let us know what you think about this haunting case. If you want to explore more cases like this one, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join us for more deep dives into the world of true crime. Until next time, stay safe. And remember, the darkest stories often come from the most unexpected places.